They say heroes are born in battle, but sometimes they're made in the middle of chaos. Meet Jose Calugas, the Filipino mess sergeant who wasn't even supposed to be fighting that day. He was cooking lunch when Japanese shells started raining down on Bataan. Then he saw it. An artillery gun crew wiped out, the gun silent while the enemy closed in. Without orders, without backup, Calugas sprinted 1,000 yards through open fire, manned the gun alone, and started firing back. One man against an army. That single act turned the tide of the fight and earned him the Medal of Honor, the first Filipino to receive it in World War II. This is the story of the man who dropped the ladle and picked up a legend. The story begins with the echo of war drums over the Pacific. It is December 1941, and the Philippines, still under American rule, is thrust into the chaos of World War II. Among thousands of Filipino soldiers stands one man, quiet but resolute. Jose Calugas, a mess sergeant in the Philippine Scouts. As bombs fall and smoke engulfs the skies of Bataan, Calugas finds himself at the crossroads of duty and destiny. This is the story of how a single act of courage under fire turned an ordinary soldier into a legend, and a name that would forever echo in history. The morning sun rises over the vast Pacific, casting golden light across the fields and mountains of the Philippine Islands. It is December 1941, and the world stands on the edge of destruction. In the distant horizon, the shadow of war spreads like a storm, creeping closer each day. In the quiet province of Iloilo, life continues with the rhythm of simplicity. Farmers tending their fields, children running barefoot on dirt roads, and families praying for peace they do not know is about to end. Among them lives a man whose name will soon be written in the chronicles of valor, though he himself does not yet know it. His name is Jose Calugas, a man of humble birth and simple dreams. Jose wakes before dawn, his hands roughened by years of labor, his heart filled with gratitude for each day he is given. The air smells of fresh soil and dew. His mother's voice echoes in memory, reminding him always to live with faith, courage, and kindness. The rooster crows as he prepares his morning meal of rice and salted fish. In his small home in Leon, Iloilo, he looks toward the sky with silent reverence, unaware that destiny is already preparing to test his strength. In those days, the Philippines is still under the flag of the United States, and the winds of war are whispered only in rumors. But the world is changing fast. Across the seas, nations crumble under the march of armies. The Japanese Empire has begun its conquest of Asia, and soon the tranquil islands will become a battleground. For Jose, however, the thought of war feels distant. He is content in his service as a mess sergeant in the Philippine Scouts, proud to wear the uniform that represents both discipline and hope. The soldiers of the Scouts come from all walks of life: farmers, laborers, students, sons of fishermen, all bound by one purpose: to defend their homeland. Among them, Jose stands out not for his rank or authority, but for his quiet determination and steadfast will. He is respected by his comrades not because he speaks loudly, but because he listens and acts with integrity. In the barracks, he shares laughter, stories, and the warmth of friendship that soldiers cling to in times of uncertainty. As dawn breaks one December morning, distant explosions shatter the calm. The sky, once blue and serene, is torn by the black smoke of bombs. War has arrived. The Japanese have struck Pearl Harbor and now turn their fury toward the Philippines. In that instant, Jose's life changes forever. The fields of his youth will soon be replaced by trenches, and the scent of earth by the stench of gunpowder. The mess sergeant, who once served meals to his brothers in arms, will soon serve something greater: his courage. And in the fiery crucible of battle, his name will be spoken not as a soldier among many, but as a hero who stood when all others fell. The quiet man from Iloilo is about to face his destiny, and in doing so, he will etch his name into the eternal story of the Battle of Bataan. Jose Calugas' journey begins not with the roar of cannons, but with the simple beating of a heart that refuses to yield, a heart that carries the unbreakable spirit of the Filipino people. Jose Calugas grew up among the green hills and rice paddies of Leon, Iloilo, where life was both simple and demanding. He was born on December 29, 1907, to a modest family who knew the meaning of hard work. His early years were spent helping his parents in the fields, planting rice beneath the burning sun, and harvesting it beneath the watchful glow of the moon. From childhood, he learned the virtues of patience and endurance, the kind of strength not found in the body but in the heart. He was quiet and thoughtful, a young man who spoke little but whose actions spoke for him. When he came of age, Jose dreamed of something greater. He wanted to serve, to build a life that would bring honor to his family and his country. In 1930, he enlisted in the Philippine Scouts, an elite unit under the command of the United States Army. The Scouts were known for their discipline, skill, and loyalty, and Jose found in them a purpose that would define him. He trained relentlessly, mastering the art of soldiering, from cleaning rifles to marching in perfect formation. Though his duties began as routine, his dedication soon earned the respect of his superiors. Life as a scout was rigorous. Days began before sunrise with the sound of the bugle and ended long after dusk. Yet for Jose, it was a life of meaning. He rose through discipline and humility, eventually serving as a mess sergeant in the 88th Field Artillery Regiment. His responsibility was to feed the men, but his influence extended far beyond the kitchen. He was a symbol of steadiness, a man who carried himself with quiet pride. The soldiers trusted him not just to prepare their meals, but to remind them of home and the strength they fought for. When the drums of war began to echo across the Pacific, Jose and his comrades could feel the tension in the air. They had heard of Japan's march through China and its growing power, but they believed in their cause and in the alliance between America and the Philippines. In the camps, whispers of conflict grew louder. The men trained harder, the nights grew longer, and the silence before dawn became heavier. Jose wrote letters home when he could, telling his family that all was well. He did not speak of fear, only of duty. For him, being a soldier meant standing ready, no matter what came. He was a man of few words, but in his heart burned an unwavering promise to serve faithfully and to protect his brothers in arms. As he looked out toward the horizon, unaware of the chaos soon to come, he stood firm in his belief that courage was not the absence of fear, but the will to act in spite of it. The year was 1941, and the winds that carried the scent of the Pacific also carried the whispers of war. In the Philippines, the soldiers of the Philippine Scouts went about their duties with disciplined calm, unaware that their lives were about to be swept into the storm. At Fort Stotsenburg, north of Manila, the 88th Field Artillery Regiment trained under the tropical sun. The days were long and demanding, but the camaraderie among men gave them strength. They drilled, cleaned weapons, and studied maps, laughing between tasks and sharing dreams of the future. Among them, Sergeant Jose Calugas moved with quiet purpose, always dependable, always steady. For Calugas and his comrades, military life was a balance of order and routine. Mornings began with the blare of the bugle, followed by roll call and training. The men ran drills across open fields, their boots pounding against the earth, their sweat glistening under the light of a sun that seemed to burn without mercy. The artillery crews practiced their aim and coordination, learning to move and fire as one. When the day's duties were done, the soldiers gathered around mess tables, eating simple meals and sharing stories of home. There was laughter and teasing, a sense of brotherhood that turned strangers into family. Yet, beneath the surface, unease simmered. The radio reports from abroad spoke of Japanese advances in Asia, Manchuria, China, French Indochina. The soldiers listened in silence, trading uncertain glances but saying little. Some shrugged it off, believing that the Philippines, protected by its alliance with the United States, would remain safe. Others, more seasoned, sensed that trouble was coming. In quiet conversations by lantern light, they spoke of rumors from the north, of ships moving across the seas and aircraft seen far beyond the horizon. Jose remained focused on his duties. He was not one to speculate or speak of things beyond his control. His work was his world, and he poured himself into it with discipline and care. His mess hall was a place of order amid the chaos of rumor. He ensured that every man under his watch was fed and ready, for he believed that even in peace, preparation was the soldier's first duty. Still, when he looked out across the base at night, he could not shake a growing tension in his chest. The world felt quieter than usual, as if holding its breath. In early December, the calm became eerie. Training continued, but orders became more urgent. American officers reviewed defense plans, and the Philippine scouts were placed on alert. Airfields were watched more closely, and ammunition supplies were quietly moved. The men sensed something shifting, though no one could say exactly what. Letters from home arrived with words of reassurance, but each word felt heavy with unspoken fear. On the evening of December 7, 1941, the soldiers gathered for supper, unaware that across the Pacific, the skies above Pearl Harbor were being torn apart by flames. That night, the wind carried the faint scent of rain and gun oil. Jose cleaned his mess gear, his movements deliberate and calm, as though his hands already knew what his heart refused to admit, that peace was slipping away. At dawn on December 8th, the sound of engines filled the sky. At first, the men thought they were American planes conducting drills. Then came the scream of falling bombs. The ground erupted as explosions ripped through Clark Field, sending plumes of smoke and dirt into the air. Panic spread through the camp as men dove for cover, the deafening roar of destruction drowning out all other sound. Calugas ran outside, his instinct sharpened by training and fear. Above him, dark silhouettes of Japanese bombers cut across the morning light like shadows of death. The attack lasted minutes, but it felt eternal. When the noise finally faded, the once peaceful base was a ruin of fire and twisted metal. The smell of fuel and blood filled the air. The soldiers scrambled to regroup, some aiding the wounded, others preparing for what they knew would come next. Jose helped carry the injured to shelter, his uniform stained with dust and sweat. He did not speak, he only acted. Word spread quickly. Pearl Harbor had been attacked, and now the Philippines was at war. Orders were issued to fall back and regroup. The U.S. and Philippine forces began to withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula, the last stronghold in the face of the advancing Japanese army. Trucks loaded with equipment rumbled down muddy roads, while soldiers marched through the tropical heat, their faces hardened by shock. Calugas's unit was among them, assigned to defensive positions in the rugged terrain of Bataan. As they moved deeper into the jungle, the reality of war settled in. The nights were filled with the distant sound of artillery, and the skies burned red at dawn. Calugas felt the weight of what was to come, but he never wavered. To him, duty was simple: stand, fight, and survive. When the regiment reached its assigned position, the men began fortifying the line, setting up artillery pieces and digging foxholes. The earth beneath them became both home and grave. In those early days of the invasion, courage and fear lived side by side. The soldiers of Bataan knew they were outnumbered and undersupplied, yet they held their ground. For Jose Calugas, the quiet man from Iloilo, who had once fed his comrades with rice and laughter, the war had begun in full. The sound of the bugle no longer called men to drill, but to battle. And though the world around him burned, his spirit did not falter. The mess sergeant of the Philippine Scouts was now a soldier at the front, standing in the heart of history as the storm of war swept across his homeland. The Battle of Bataan had begun, and the once lush and peaceful peninsula was transformed into a fortress of desperation. Jungle trails became trenches, and rice paddies turned into killing fields. The men of the Philippine Scouts, the U.S. Army, and the Filipino divisions fought side by side against an enemy that advanced relentlessly. For Jose Calugas and his comrades in the 88th Field Artillery Regiment, each day was a struggle between courage and exhaustion. Supplies were dwindling, food was scarce, and the sound of gunfire echoed through the humid air like an endless drum. The sun in Bataan was merciless. It burned down on soldiers who dug into the earth with bare hands, fortifying their positions against bombardment. Sweat mixed with dust until their faces became masks of mud and fatigue. The enemy's artillery pounded from the north, shaking the ground beneath their boots. Each explosion reminded them that there was no retreat, only survival. Yet amid the thunder of war, there was resolve. The defenders of Bataan fought not for glory, but for their homeland, their families, and each other. Jose moved with quiet efficiency, his every action deliberate and measured. As a mess sergeant, his duty was to feed the men, but now his work had become an act of defiance. With every meal he prepared, he reminded his comrades that they were still human, still fighting, still alive. He scrounged for ingredients wherever he could find them, handfuls of rice, scraps of meat, whatever the supply lines could spare. Sometimes, there was nothing at all, only the bitter water from the rivers and the taste of salt from their sweat. Still, he served what he could, because he understood that hunger was the enemy's quietest weapon. The soldiers fought on, their stomachs empty, but their hearts unbroken. They faced air raids daily, Japanese bombers screaming across the sky and raining death on their positions. Foxholes became their only shelter. When the bombs fell, Jose threw himself into his duties, ensuring that those who survived had food and water waiting when it was safe to emerge. He did not complain, nor did he rest long. Every small act of care became a form of resistance, a way to keep morale alive amid despair. The jungle around them seemed to close in, thick with vines and smoke. The nights were filled with the constant hum of insects and the distant cries of the wounded. Disease crept through the camps, malaria, dysentery, fever, claiming more men than the bullets did. Medical supplies ran out, and the rations grew smaller by the day. Yet the defenders held the line. The Japanese expected them to surrender quickly, but the men of Bataan fought with a ferocity born of pride. Calugas watched his comrades with admiration and sorrow. He saw young men who had once joked and laughed now stand in silence, their eyes hardened by the sight of death. He saw officers leading from the front, refusing to yield even as their ranks thinned. He saw the courage of men who knew they were fighting a losing battle but chose to stand anyway. And he felt something awaken in himself, a determination deeper than duty, a fire that no fear could extinguish. Each day brought new orders, new attacks, and new losses. The 88th Field Artillery Regiment fired its guns until the barrels overheated, raining shells upon advancing Japanese lines. The men worked like machines, exhausted but unyielding. Jose, though not part of the gun crews, often moved between positions, carrying supplies, passing messages, and helping where he was needed. He refused to stay idle, even when his duties did not require him to fight. He knew that every pair of hands counted. By January 1942, the defenders were stretched to their limits. Ammunition was running dangerously low, and reinforcements were nowhere in sight. The Japanese had cut off major supply routes, leaving the soldiers isolated and starving. Despite the hardships, the spirit of resistance endured. The soldiers still sang songs of home at night, their voices weak but defiant. They still shared their last rations with one another, refusing to let anyone go hungry if it could be helped. Jose often sat near the edge of camp after nightfall, cleaning his rifle by the flicker of a dying fire. He thought of Iloilo, of his family, and of the peaceful fields that seemed so far away. He prayed quietly, not for victory but for strength, to endure another day, to help another man survive, to face whatever awaited them with courage. The battle raged on, each skirmish drawing them deeper into exhaustion. The artillery duels were relentless, the enemy growing bolder as the defenders weakened. Yet amid the chaos, the men of Bataan refused to break. When one gun fell silent, another opened fire. When one soldier collapsed, another took his place. And through it all, Jose Calugas remained steady, his resolve unshaken. He did not yet know that soon, on a day that would test his very soul, his courage would rise above the noise of battle and become a beacon for all who still dared to fight. For now, he was simply one among many, tired, hungry, and determined. But in his heart, there was a strength that even he could not measure. The mess sergeant who once fed his men would soon feed their hope with an act of valor that would echo through the ages. The Battle of Bataan was far from over, and Jose Calugas' moment of destiny was drawing near. January 16, 1942. The morning air was heavy with smoke and dust, and the distant thunder of artillery never ceased. The once green hills of Bataan were now scarred with craters and strewn with the wreckage of war. The men of the 88th Field Artillery Regiment had been fighting for weeks without rest, holding their ground against an enemy that grew stronger each day. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, exhaustion weighed on their limbs, and yet they stood their posts, determined to resist until the very end. Amid the chaos and despair, one man's courage was about to turn the tide, if only for a fleeting moment. At Kulis Bataan, the regiment's artillery positions were under heavy fire. Japanese guns had found their range, and shells exploded across the hillside with terrifying precision. The defenders clung to their positions as earth and metal rained down upon them. One of the artillery batteries, a key position, was struck directly. The crew was wiped out, and the gun fell silent. its barrel still smoking. For a moment, there was only the sound of the enemy's advance, their soldiers moving closer, sensing an opening in the defensive line. Jose Calugas, positioned nearly 1,000 yards away at the mess area, heard the explosions and saw the billowing smoke. He understood immediately what had happened. The enemy's fire was concentrated on that silent gun, the one that now lay abandoned. Without it, their line would falter, and the Japanese could break through. Around him, men shouted orders and scrambled for cover, but Calugas did not hesitate. He dropped what he was doing, tightened the strap of his helmet, and began to run. The open field between his position and the destroyed gun was a death trap. Bullets cracked through the air, shells burst around him, and the ground shook with every explosion. Yet Calugas pressed forward, sprinting through mud and shrapnel, his heart pounding but his mind focused. Each step felt like an eternity. He could feel the heat of explosions on his face, hear the whistle of bullets passing inches from his body, and taste the grit of earth thrown up by near misses. Still, he did not stop. To the men watching from the trenches, it seemed impossible. One man running through a storm of fire towards certain death. When he reached the gun position, the sight was grim. The crew lay still, their bodies covered in dust and blood. Smoke rose from the shattered earth, and the smell of gunpowder was thick in the air. Calugas knelt beside the weapon, checking its mechanism. It was damaged, but not destroyed. He wiped the sweat from his eyes, grabbed a shell and loaded the gun himself. His hands moved with the precision of training, the calm of discipline born from years of service. Then he took aim, sighted the advancing enemy and fired. The shell screamed through the air and struck its target with deadly accuracy. The explosion tore through the Japanese line, halting their advance. The men behind Calugas cheered, but he did not stop to listen. He loaded another round and another, working the gun as if possessed by an unbreakable will. Each blast echoed through the valley, a defiant roar against overwhelming odds. Alone, he manned the weapon, turning it once again into a living part of the defense. Reinforcements soon arrived, fellow soldiers who had witnessed his act of bravery and were inspired to join him. Together, they re-established the battery and continued to fire until the Japanese attack was repelled. When the smoke finally cleared, the enemy had withdrawn, their advance broken by the determination of one man. The battlefield fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the distant echo of retreating footsteps and the soft rustle of wind through scorched grass. Jose Calugas stood beside the gun, his uniform torn and streaked with mud, his face blackened by smoke. He was breathing hard, his hands trembling from exhaustion, but his eyes burned with quiet triumph. Around him, the soldiers who had watched his charge began to gather, staring in disbelief. They knew what they had just witnessed. Against every instinct of self-preservation, against every calculation of survival, one man had run through hell to save them all. Word of his bravery spread quickly through the ranks. Men spoke his name with reverence, their spirits lifted by what he had done. In a time when defeat seemed certain, his courage reminded them that honor still lived among them. Officers commended his valor, and the act was reported up the chain of command. To those who fought beside him, he was no longer just Sergeant Calugas, the quiet mess sergeant from Iloilo. He was something more, a symbol of the Filipino spirit, unyielding and fierce even in the darkest hour. That night, as the sky glowed faintly from the distant fires of battle, Calugas sat alone beside the gun he had saved. The air was cool, and the stars shone faintly through the drifting smoke. He thought not of glory or recognition, but of the men he had served with, their laughter, their courage, and the silent promise they all carried to fight for as long as they could stand. His body ached, but his heart was at peace. He had done what needed to be done, nothing more, nothing less. In the coming days, the fighting would continue, and the hardships would grow worse. But for that single day at Cullis, one man's bravery had turned despair into hope. The defenders of Bataan would remember it, carrying the story through the long months of struggle that followed. And though the war would take many lives and test the limits of endurance, the courage of Jose Calugas would shine as a light in the darkness. a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming fear, one man's resolve could change the course of battle, if only for a moment. The days following the battle at Calugas were a blur of exhaustion and disbelief. The men of the 88th Field Artillery Regiment had witnessed something extraordinary, and though the fighting raged on, word of Jose Calugas' actions spread through the ranks like wildfire. Soldiers who had nearly given up found new strength in his example. They whispered about the man who had run through enemy fire to reclaim a fallen gun, who had stood alone when all others had fallen. His courage became more than a story. It became a reason to keep fighting. The officers soon took notice. Reports of his heroism reached the command post, where it was recorded and sent up the chain to the higher command of the United States Army forces in the Far East. His name was mentioned in dispatches, accompanied by the details of his daring act. For the men who fought beside him, it was not just official recognition. It was validation that even in defeat, valor still lived among them. They saw in him the embodiment of their shared struggle, the quiet endurance, the fierce pride, and the unbreakable will that defined the defenders of Bataan. But recognition came amid ruin. The situation in Bataan was growing desperate. The Japanese bombardment intensified with each passing day, their attacks coordinated and relentless. The defenders were starving. Their uniforms hung loosely from their bodies, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Malaria, dysentery, and fever spread through the camps like wildfire. Rations were cut again and again until there was almost nothing left to eat but rice mixed with salt or crushed banana stems boiled in water. Yet through it all, the men continued to fight, holding on to whatever strength they could muster. Jose Calugas remained steadfast. Though his act of heroism had made him a symbol among his comrades, he never sought praise. He continued his duties with the same humility that had always defined him. When others called him a hero, he would shake his head and say that he had only done what needed to be done. But those who had seen him on that day knew the truth. What he had done was something few men could ever bring themselves to do. It was courage in its purest form, born not of desire for recognition, but of love for his brothers in arms. Even as supplies dwindled and morale waned, Calugas encouraged his fellow soldiers. He shared his rations, tended to the wounded when medics were scarce, and worked tirelessly to keep spirits alive. His quiet leadership inspired those around him to endure. In the evenings, as the jungle fell into uneasy silence, he would sit with the younger soldiers and talk of home. The smell of the fields in Iloilo after rain, the laughter of children playing in the streets, the sound of church bells at dawn. For a few brief moments, his words made them forget the horrors of war and remember what they were fighting for. When officers approached him weeks later with news of a commendation, he was taken by surprise. His act at Calugas had been officially recognized, and he was being recommended for the Medal of Honor, the highest award for bravery that the United States could bestow. It was an honor no Filipino soldier had yet received during the war. Calugas listened in silence as his commanding officer read the citation aloud. It described his selfless courage under fire, his disregard for personal safety, and the decisive action that helped repel the enemy's advance. When the reading ended, the men around him cheered, their weary voices breaking through the tension that had bound them for weeks. But Jose did not smile. He accepted the words with gratitude, yet his heart was heavy. There was no joy in heroism when the world around him was falling apart. Every victory was paid for in blood, and every act of bravery came at the cost of another man's life. He did not see himself as special. He saw himself as one among many who had given everything they could. The medal, he said softly, was not his alone. It belonged to all of them. The recognition of his valor gave the defenders a fleeting sense of hope. In the face of starvation, sickness, and relentless assault, they clung to stories like his. They reminded themselves that they were not fighting in vain, that the world beyond their shores would one day know what they had endured. Newspapers in the United States later carried reports of his bravery, though few could imagine the true suffering of the soldiers still trapped in Bataan. As the months dragged on, the situation became unbearable. Ammunition was nearly gone, supplies were exhausted, and reinforcements would never come. The defenders of Bataan were isolated, surrounded, and starving, yet they continued to resist. Calugas kept his composure through it all. his eyes calm even as the lines of fatigue deepened across his face. When others faltered, he reminded them to stand firm. When the bombs fell, he moved among the men, helping the wounded and giving comfort where he could. By early April 1942, the once proud army of Bataan was reduced to shadows of its former strength. Disease and hunger had done what bullets could not. Still, Jose Calugas refused to lose faith. His courage, once tested in the heat of battle, now endured in the quiet struggle to survive. Though the promise of victory had faded, he held fast to something stronger: the belief that sacrifice itself was a kind of triumph. His act of bravery at Cullis had become legend among the men. It was a story passed in hushed tones by the campfires, retold to lift spirits and remind them of what true courage looked like. To the soldiers of Bataan, Jose Calugas was no longer just a name. He was a symbol of resistance, proof that even in the darkest moment of war, a single act of selflessness could light the way for all. And though he could not yet know it, that day of fire and courage would carry his name far beyond the battlefields of Bataan. It would endure long after the guns had fallen silent, remembered by generations who would speak his name with reverence, as the man who stood his ground when all hope seemed lost, the man whose bravery became the heartbeat of a dying army, and whose strength reminded the world that the Filipino spirit could never be conquered. The surrender of Bataan came like a shadow creeping over the land. On April 9, 1942, the once proud defenders, starved, sick, and exhausted, were ordered to lay down their arms. The men could hardly believe it at first. After months of hardship, they had hoped for relief, for reinforcements, for something more than the quiet voice of defeat echoing through the ranks. But the truth could not be denied. The ammunition was gone, the food long exhausted, and the bodies of the fallen marked the final line of resistance. There was nothing left to fight with but courage, and even that had been worn thin. Jose Calugas stood among his comrades, rifle in hand, staring at the ground as the order spread. The once echoing roar of battle was replaced by an eerie silence. Men wept openly, their faces streaked with grime and despair. Others stood motionless, refusing to believe that the struggle had ended this way. They had fought not only for their homeland but for honor, for the belief that they could withstand the storm. And now, under the blinding tropical sun, they were told to march, not toward victory, but toward captivity. The journey that followed would become one of the darkest chapters in human history. It began as a line of weary soldiers stretching for miles, Filipinos and Americans alike, forced to walk north toward San Fernando under the relentless gaze of their captors. The Japanese soldiers showed no mercy. Anyone who stumbled or fell was beaten, bayoneted, or shot. The heat was unbearable, and the road seemed endless. The men called it the Death March. Jose Calugas walked among them, his uniform tattered, his boots worn thin. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, thirst burned his throat, and yet he pressed on, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Around him, men collapsed one by one, their strength drained by exhaustion and disease. The air was filled with the cries of the dying, the dull thud of rifle butts, and the suffocating stench of death. Still, Calugas refused to fall. He whispered words of encouragement to those beside him, urging them to hold on just a little longer. He shared what little water he had, tore strips from his shirt to bandage the wounded, and lifted those who could no longer walk. At times, he thought of home, of the green fields of Panay, of his family waiting for news that might never come. The thought of them gave him strength. He remembered the day he had stood by the fallen artillery piece, the smoke and thunder of battle all around him. That memory became his anchor, a reminder that he had faced death before and had not yielded. Now, he faced a different kind of battle, a struggle not of weapons, but of endurance and will. The march stretched on for days. The prisoners were denied food and water, forced to drink from muddy ditches or stagnant puddles. The heat blistered their skin and their feet bled through their torn shoes. Every step was agony, every breath a reminder of their frailty. Some prayed aloud, others cursed their fate. But through it all, Calugas remained silent, his resolve unbroken. He had seen too much to waste his strength on despair. He focused on surviving, one painful step at a time. When they reached San Fernando, the survivors were crammed into boxcars, wooden freight cars meant for cargo, not men. The doors were sealed, trapping hundreds in suffocating heat. There was no air, no space to move, and no water. The stench of death filled the air as the train lurched forward toward Capas. Men collapsed where they stood, their bodies pressed against one another in silent suffering. Calugas stood among them, gripping the side of the car, his breath shallow, his mind drifting between exhaustion and determination. He refused to die there. When they finally arrived at Camp O'Donnell, the true horror of captivity began. The camp was overcrowded, disease-ridden, and devoid of mercy. Thousands perished within weeks from starvation, malaria, and dysentery. The guards offered no aid, and the dead were buried in shallow graves. Calugas, weakened but alive, forced himself to endure. He gathered fallen comrades, shared scraps of food, and whispered prayers over the dead. He had become a soldier without a gun, a man fighting not an enemy but death itself. In the midst of the suffering, Calugas never abandoned his humanity. He risked punishment to share stolen food, carried water for those too weak to move, and comforted the dying. His quiet strength inspired those around him, even when hope seemed lost. Though his body grew thin and frail, his spirit remained unbroken. In the darkest corners of the camp, he reminded others of what they were still fighting for: the dream of freedom, the hope of seeing their homeland again. For months, he endured the unendurable. Each day was a test of faith and will. He watched friends die beside him and buried them with trembling hands. He saw cruelty beyond comprehension and yet refused to surrender his soul to despair. When he finally emerged from captivity, he was a shadow of the man he had once been, but his eyes still held the same quiet fire. He had survived when so many had not because of strength alone, but because of a heart that refused to give in. Jose Calugas' journey through the death march and imprisonment became another testament to his indomitable spirit. He had faced death on the battlefield and endured it again in the march of suffering. And through it all, he carried with him the same courage that had defined his act at Culis. The courage not just to fight, but to live, to endure, and to honor the memory of those who could not. The liberation of the Philippines in 1945 brought with it a mixture of relief and sorrow. Towns lay in ruins, families were scattered, and the memory of Bataan lingered like an open wound across the islands. For the survivors, freedom came at a cost too heavy to measure. Among those who lived to see the flag rise once again was Jose Calugas. He had endured years of captivity, hunger, and forced labor, his body weakened, but his spirit unbroken. When the American and Filipino forces finally drove the Japanese from the land, he stood beneath the sun of his homeland once more, breathing in the air of freedom he had never stopped believing would return. After his release, he was brought to a military hospital for recovery. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive. Malnutrition and disease had taken their toll, and his once strong frame was now frail and worn. But even as he struggled to regain his strength, his thoughts were not of himself. He asked about his comrades, those who had marched beside him, those who had fallen in Bataan, and those who had not lived to see liberation. He spoke their names softly, as though to keep them alive in memory, his voice carrying the weight of thousands who could no longer speak for themselves. When the war finally ended, recognition for the defenders of Bataan began to reach the public. The stories of their endurance, their courage, and their sacrifice spread across the world. Among these stories was that of a Filipino soldier who had charged through enemy fire to man a gun that had fallen silent. The act had not been forgotten. The documents, written years earlier amid the chaos of war, had survived. In 1945, the United States government formally awarded Jose Calugas the Medal of Honor. He was the first Filipino soldier of World War II to receive that distinction. The medal, with its blue ribbon and golden star, represented the highest recognition of valor in combat that the United States could bestow. When the award was presented to him, he stood at attention, his uniform crisp, his bearing humble. As the citation was read aloud, the room fell silent. The words described his gallantry at Culis, his fearless advance under heavy fire, and his decisive action that turned the tide of battle. The audience listened, moved by the image of a man who had risked everything not for glory, but for duty. When asked about his feelings, Calugas spoke quietly. He said the medal was not his alone. It belonged to all who had fought and died in Bataan, to every Filipino and American soldier who had held the line against impossible odds. He accepted the honor not as a symbol of personal achievement, but as a tribute to the courage of his people. For him, it was a reminder that even in defeat, dignity and valor could never be erased. After the war, Jose Calugas continued to serve in the Philippine Scouts. The military had become more than a profession to him. It was a calling, a way to honor those who could no longer stand beside him. He was later granted U.S. citizenship and moved to the United States, where he continued his service in the Army until his retirement. Life in a foreign land was far from easy, but he carried with him the same resilience that had seen him through war and captivity. In his later years, he spoke occasionally to young soldiers and students about Bataan, about what it meant to fight for one's country, and about the price of freedom. His voice was calm and steady, never seeking to glorify war, but to remind others of the strength found in unity and sacrifice. He often said that courage was not about being fearless, but about doing what was right even when fear was overwhelming. Those who met him were struck by his humility. There was no arrogance in his words, only the quiet conviction of a man who had faced the worst of humanity and had chosen to keep his faith and goodness intact. In the Philippines, his name was remembered with honor. Schools, streets, and veterans organizations spoke of him as an example of the true Filipino hero, one who did not seek recognition but earned it through selfless action. He returned to his homeland several times, visiting the memorials of Bataan and laying flowers at the graves of the fallen. Each visit was a pilgrimage of remembrance. He would stand before the markers, his eyes heavy with memory, and whisper a prayer for those who had never returned. He lived to see his story taught to younger generations, his act of bravery preserved in the annals of history. Yet, for all the recognition he received, he never changed the simplicity that defined him. He worked, cared for his family, and lived quietly, content that he had done his duty. His medal was displayed not as a trophy, but as a symbol of a collective spirit, a reminder of a generation that had suffered and endured so that freedom could rise again from the ashes. Even as age slowed him, his eyes still carried the same fire that had burned on the battlefield of Culis. When people thanked him for his service, he would smile softly and say that he had only done what any man should do when faced with injustice. He believed that the true measure of a hero was not found in medals or honors, but in the willingness to act with courage when courage was most needed. In time, the world moved forward, but the memory of Jose Calugas remained. His legacy stood not only in history books, but in the spirit of every Filipino who continued to believe in bravery, resilience, and sacrifice. He had lived through war, captivity, and loss, yet emerged with hope intact. His story became part of the nation's soul, a timeless reminder that, even in the darkest hour, one man's courage can light the path for generations to come. Jose Calugas passed from this world on January 8, 1977, leaving behind a legacy that would never fade. His life was a testament to courage, humility, and unwavering duty. From the quiet fields of Iloilo to the burning hills of Bataan, from the horrors of the Death March to the quiet dignity of post-war life, he embodied the spirit of a hero in its purest form. He did not seek fame or fortune. He sought only to serve his country and protect those around him. Yet in doing so, he became a symbol, not just of bravery, but of the resilience of the Filipino people. His Medal of Honor, proudly displayed, was more than a decoration. It was a story of sacrifice and determination, a story that would inspire generations to come. Schools, memorials, and veterans organizations kept his memory alive, ensuring that the courage he showed under fire would never be forgotten. His acts reminded all who heard them that true heroism is not measured by rank or recognition, but by the willingness to act selflessly in the face of overwhelming danger. Even today, the name Jose Calugas resonates across the Philippines and beyond, a beacon of hope and a reminder that one individual's courage can ignite the spirit of many. His story endures, a testament to honor, sacrifice, and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit.